Hey guys, AJ here, and today I'd like to share some early thoughts on Kazuha and why I think he could turn out to be the best animal support for certain melee elemental DPS units, especially those that do not rely on melt or vaporize. Among the 5-star carries we know of so far, only 3 units actually match this description, those being Electro-Keqing, Ayaka, and Childe if you're playing with Beidou and Fischl for Electro-Charged. And I'm gonna try and explain what Kazuha can do for these 3 units in particular better than any other animal support. Now before I get pilloried for mentioning Ayaka, who may or may not get a complete rework before she gets released, everything I'm about to say still applies to her if, by the time she's released, she still fulfills the following 3 criteria. She's cryo, she uses a sword, and she has the cryo infusion in her base kit. She may be one of the oldest units in the game all the way back from CBT1, but I don't really see them changing any of these core aspects about her. Again, I could be wrong, but for the sake of this video I'm going to consider her as well because she might make the most use of a support Kazuha. Before that though, let's have a look at Kazuha's base kit and find out what his main selling points are, and in my opinion there are 2. The first is his wind tunnel that he generates after using his elemental skill, and the second is his passive that allows him to convert his own elemental mastery into elemental damage buffs for the team. The great thing about his wind tunnel is that it's the only animal skill available in the game that can group up enemies without knocking them back or up. If we compare this ability with other animal supports that can group enemies up, Anemo main character knocks enemies back, Sucrose repeatedly knocks them up, Jean sends them flying, and Venti suspends them in the air where they're quite difficult to hit for melee units. All of these skills cause DPS downtime for units like Keqing, for example, because you either have to catch up to blown away enemies, or you have to wait for them to fall back to the ground again. With Kazuha, it's more like you have the Battle Pass bow's passive skill built into his kit. It simply takes a couple enemies and groups them up right in front of you, so I can imagine that this could be really convenient for not only Keqing but also Ayaka, especially Childe because of his overlapping Riptide effects, but also every other DPS that's not ranged. Now there are many things we don't know about this wind tunnel yet, for example how strong the pull effect is, how much of a range it has, so these are things we'll just have to wait and see, but the idea is definitely there. Now to the second part, his elemental mastery conversion. Here the idea is that you take an element of your team member, let's say Electro, swirl it with Kazuha, and that'll give every unit on your team except Kazuha an electro damage bonus for the next 8 seconds. You can also swirl multiple different elements at the same time for a separate elemental damage bonus for each swirled element. So for example, if you're running an Electro-Charged team with Keqing and Xingqiu, you can swirl both Electro and Hydro at the same time, and that way Keqing is going to benefit from the Electro damage buff and Xingqiu from the Hydro damage buff. Keep in mind that Anemo, Geo, and physical damage cannot be swirled, so you also cannot buff any of these 3 damage types. Now the strength of this elemental damage buff is based on Kazuha's elemental mastery, and the last time I checked it was at a rate of 0.04% damage bonus for each point of elemental mastery Kazuha has. So at 500 EM, for example, you would get a 20% elemental damage bonus. Now there are a few reasons why this EM conversion could be really strong for certain carries, and to demonstrate that I will compare this mechanic with Sucrose because she's the only animal support that has something similar to this built into her kit. In Sucrose's case, she doesn't convert EM into elemental damage buffs, but instead she simply shares a portion of her own elemental mastery with her teammates. Now let's assume for a second that you didn't already betray Keqing a long time ago and you're still running her as your main carry with Xingqiu. For this team comp, adding an animal support with a 4-piece VV would be a great way to boost its damage. If you use a 500 EM Sucrose for that, both of her passive abilities combined net you 150 EM for your Keqing, meaning that your Electro-Charged reaction would be a lot stronger than it was before. If you use Kazuha, instead of 150 EM, you would gain a 20% Electro damage bonus and a 20% Hydro damage bonus for your team. The same would be true, for example, in an Electro-Charged comp with Childe and Beidou and Fischl. Now I think it's quite clear that going for Kazuha in this case would boost your team's damage a lot more than Sucrose, and that's not only because he's a 5-star and Sucrose a 4-star, but also because Elemental Mastery as a stat isn't all that amazing for non-amplifying reactions such as Electro-Charged. This could change with 1.6 as non-amplifying reactions are going to receive buffs, but I'm going to go out on a limb here and claim that even after the buffs, going for the elemental damage bonus would still be way better than going for elemental mastery. Now with Ayaka as a permafreeze carry, Kazuha would become even better. The short version of why I think Ayaka is going to be an excellent permafreeze carry is that among the 3 elemental reactions she'll have access to, Superconduct doesn't make much sense as she's an elemental DPS. Melt will be hard to execute since her attack speed is too high and she'd be the aura most of the time, not the reaction trigger, and that leaves only Freeze. She doesn't wield a claymore, so she can actually keep enemies frozen, unlike Chongyun and Eula. And if we equip the 4-piece Blizzard Straya set on her and combine her Cryo Infusion with Xingqiu's Rain Swords, we have the perfect permafreeze setup with just 2 units, leaving enough room for another Cryo unit for the Cryo Resonance and an Anemo support to reduce Hydro and Cryo resistance with 4 VV. In this type of team comp, half of Sucrose's kit suddenly becomes useless because sharing her Elemental Mastery doesn't do anything for the Freeze reaction since Freeze doesn't deal any damage. And we're not shattering frozen enemies either. Kazuha, on the other hand, can still swirl both Cryo and Hydro and generate elemental damage buffs for Ayaka and Xingqiu on top of reducing enemy resistances. Now that they changed Ayaka's Ascension stat from Cryo damage to crit damage, another reason Kazuha's elemental damage buff is particularly good on Keqing and Ayaka is that both have a hard time scaling their inherent elemental damage bonus past what they get from their goblet and their respective 2-piece set effects, meaning oftentimes they're stuck at just 61% elemental damage bonus without Kazuha. By this point you may be wondering why I'm excluding other melee carriers such as Hu Tao and Diluc from this discussion, and I'm definitely not saying that Kazuha won't be useful for these units, especially with constellations like his C2, but unlike with Freeze and other non-amplifying reactions, Elemental Mastery is actually quite useful for Vaporize and Melt units, meaning Sucrose is always a great alternative and a much cheaper one at that. If MiHoYo balances Kazuha right, he is going to be better than Sucrose even for the likes of Hu Tao and so on, but in that case the question then is whether he as an expensive 5-star is worth the upgrade over someone like Sucrose. One last thing I'd like to point out though is that people seem to be overrating Sucrose's C6 a lot when comparing it to Kazuha's passive. In order to get the 20% elemental damage buff from Sucrose's C6, you need to absorb that element with her Butterfly. First of all, this means that you can only ever have one elemental buff active at a time. Secondly, it only lasts for as long as the ultimate itself, so 8 seconds at best on a 20-second cooldown. And lastly, it can be quite difficult to absorb the correct element when there's a lot of stuff going on around you. Kazuha's buffs also last 8 seconds, but you just need to swirl your elements of choice, not absorb them with your ultimate, and just swirling is much easier than absorbing. You can swirl with your E, and Kazuha's ultimate is going to continuously swirl for you for like 8 seconds after casting it, meaning that as long as you keep doing your thing with your DPS units, you're going to keep swirling your elements. And even after Kazuha's ultimate runs out, you'll keep the buff for another 8 seconds. So that's already 16-second uptime on elemental buffs with an ultimate that's on a 15-second cooldown. Anyway, until his official release, there are of course many other questions that we cannot answer yet. We don't know how his own damage compares to that of other supports, we don't know if he generates enough energy, and we don't know if he's clunky to play, having to plunge attack before every wind tunnel for example, and so on. So these are things we're going to find out eventually. I just wanted to take the time and think a bit about where he could potentially shine, because many people seem to not be very hyped about him, and I thought I'd share that with you. That's it for this video. As always, if you have any questions or feedback, feel free to leave a comment or hit me up on Discord, and I'll see you in the next one.